Welcome to the Zachrilege Cast podcast YouTube video interview program that features me talking to some of the best and brightest in the atheist / secular / awesome community. This is episode 263. I recorded this interview on October 11th, 2021. Thank you to Corey for being on, and thanks for William Shatner for going to space, because, that's a thing. And I really like the picture of him wearing the yellow outfit and the other guys wearing red, as if they're red shirts. And if you hear purring in the background, that's my cat, Soy, finally on the show. Who is Dr. Darren Slade? He is a busy Miller flipper. His origin story is discovering a family King James Bible, becoming an evangelist who attended a prosperity megachurch. What turned him? Well, actually reading the book turned him. We talk about GCRR, Sherm, FaithX, losing one's community to gain another, and if you missed the video version, just know that he's a snappy dresser. Let's start the conversation.
Look, here's what I'm trying to tell you. I understand your hopelessness. I mean, right now, this country feels like the lobby of the Overlook Hotel, just moments before the elevator opens and we're all drowned in blood. But the only way to make things better is to try.
Welcome to the Zachrilege Cast. Dr. Darren M. Slade, welcome to the show.
All right, thanks for having me.
Now, we occasionally, and I say we because there's only one person here, makes perfect sense, sometimes start with doing like an out-of-context quote, but I feel like this will lead into your background, which is how these interviews usually start. So the quote is, "I was a really shitty evangelist." I can emphasize the right word. Anyway, so what is your personal religious background?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up religious at all and wasn't exactly exposed to religion, but I had a very strong spiritual experience when I was about 18. And that led me to become a diehard Christian and evangelical. I began first in one of those health and wealth prosperity gospel churches, a membership of 12,000 people. And that was my exposure to religion and the gospel and the Bible. So a lot of that colored my own ministry experience later on when I eventually went into seminary. I got 2 master's degrees in theology and divinity and became a Baptist minister, wanted to start my own church. So I was absolutely on fire for Christ, was a hardcore fundamentalist at first. And then actually through seminary, I kind of eased up on that, just became a conservative evangelical. And then as I got closer to beginning my PhD work in religion and religious history, I started to recognize significant discrepancies in my belief system, my worldview. And just on top of the fact that I love researching and I love studying. And so the stuff I was getting at seminary wasn't really fulfilling me anyway. I was gobbling that information up and then going outside and looking at the peer-reviewed research and recognized fairly quickly that there was a lot of information I wasn't being exposed to. And so back in, I would say 2014, 2015, I really started questioning whether my religion was correct. I started probing whether I was engaging in a confirmation bias and just only wanted to see and hear what I wanted to see and hear. And eventually it came because of the mounds of counter evidence against my belief system. It just was no longer intellectually feasible to hold on to my belief. So I really struggled with it for a long time. I was a closet atheist for a very long time, and then finally gave up the ghost and said, I just can't believe it anymore, and got out of it.
Well, is there an example? I don't know if it's a claim or like a historical a moment in Christianity or something from the Bible that you investigated, that you believed your whole life, or as long as you knew about Christianity, and you actually investigated it all the way and went, wait a second, this isn't right?
Absolutely. Numerous examples. Probably the biggest one, of course, is going to be the resurrection of Jesus. I was a professional apologist, and I wanted to prove Jesus really did raise from the dead. But with my studies in cognitive distortions and illusions and eyewitness testimonies and other elements that go into play here, on top of the fact of a different contradictory accounts and details of the resurrection, and the idea that the term resurrection wasn't a consistent belief, didn't mean the same thing. Each biblical author seemed to have used it. Jesus himself seemed to have used the term differently than a bodily dead corpse being revivified. There was just so much that even a rational person would never believe such a story today without sufficient evidence. And that's what we just didn't have.
When I had to get this story from your background. So I was grocery shopping a few weeks ago, and I saw this bumper sticker, and it said, "If it ain't King James, it ain't Bible." So was it a family like King James Bible that initially got you in religion, right? Do you still have one?
Do I still have? Yeah, I have probably every.
I was like, how many Bibles would you have? Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty old school belief. I was never like that as a fundamentalist.
I feel like there's some. I wish I had the exact, but it was like, in the original English or whatever, the King James Bible, whatever it was done. I can't believe it was put together. What was it, 15th, 16th century, something like that. And it was like a greatest hits almost version.
Yeah, ironically, by a homosexual king as well. So those people who absolutely adore it and think that King James is somehow divinely inspired don't have much of a history background.
Yeah, the story behind all the different versions of the Bible, or just that those could be, hours, days of content right there. Just
absolutely. And that was a big thing for me. I revered Scripture so much. I lived and breathed the Bible. I loved it, and I still do as a literary artifact. So it was a great shock to me when I started learning about textual criticism and paleontography and the clear evidence of editorial changes and revisions, not just in the process of oral transmission, but actual scribal deliberate changes to smooth out contradictions or to make stories less absurd. On top of the thousands of years of history of interpretations, coming to realize that my interpretation of Scripture was nowhere near what some of the ancient Christians and Second Temple Jews and ancient Israelites would have interpreted it as. But instead, my interpretation, my practice of religion was being formed by people in the 20th century who were preceded by people in the 18th and 17th century, and so on and so on. This history of overlaying it and overlaying it and overlaying it to the point that you're not actually reading Scripture anymore. You're reading a theology of Scripture.
Yeah, that's another thing that people don't really talk about in terms of the Bible. Like, what did the people who were reading those stories or hearing those stories in the first few centuries thought about it? And then what were the people thinking in 1000 AD or 1500 in like different communities, and they had to, it's like tailor the book to your audience. And then you talked about prosperity. I think that was one of the questions that was asked when you're on the Neil the 604 Atheist. Someone asked you, so did you get rich when you were involved in the prosperity gospel?
Nope, just my pastor. Gave every cent I could to win God's favor. What a nice little cult of personality I was in.
But you're a minister as well, right? So are you making a living as a minister? Or is that just, doing it on the weekends kind of thing?
No, it was all volunteer. It wasn't just on the weekends though.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's probably, right. If you're doing that, it's pretty much all encompassing, right?
Right. I was a seminarian, so I was involved in professional ministry, but oftentimes seminarians aren't paid. And of course, I ran several charities and things like the grocery ministry to help the community out. So I was ministering constantly, which is why you brought up the quote, I was a shitty evangelist. I loved preaching the gospel. I loved telling people about Jesus. And I didn't win that many people over. I wasn't a very good evangelist, but I loved evangelism.
Yeah, it doesn't always seem like the word itself or whatever interpretation is what gets people in the door. Like you said, the prosperity gospel, I thought it might have been a 19th century thing, but it's definitely exploded now. Like on Sunday, I was looking and it was like a 9 a.m. football game. And I was like, I don't know what channel it's on. And I turned on, like Joel Osteen showed up and I'm like, that guy just looks weird. And it's just like, yeah, it's just normal to have some super rich preacher on TV on Sunday mornings. It's just accepted as something that.
This would have been something that the earliest Christians would have thought extremely disgusting and would have saw it as evidence that he clearly didn't know Jesus or the gospel.
Yeah, I mean, he even took, was it that PPR loan when we were having that issue with all the COVID stuff?
Yeah, or just when the hurricanes and natural disasters happen, and these churches aren't even opening up their doors to help the communities out.
Yeah, that's happened. That's happened a lot. So with becoming an atheist, you have decided to use your powers for good. So what made you decide to get started with GCRR?
Well, I don't want to give the impression that I live my life to deconvert or to debunk anything. I am first and foremost an academic. And so I try as best as I can to take a neutral approach to the study of religion. What we found as an up and coming academic and somebody who wanted to be a professor, wanted his publications, I found that academia was being run a lot by religious zealots in a lot of areas. And so they were putting up a wall to where certain types of scholarship wasn't allowed to get in and wasn't allowed to be published because they had an ideology that they were wanting to protect. And we also found that just academia in general is incredibly exploitative. Authors, scholars are doing all of the footwork, pouring so much of themselves into their research, and they get nothing in return. They get their name on a book for sure, but it's extremely rare for a scholar to actually make any money off of their research. And we wanted to change the system. So we created the Global Center for Religious Research to attempt turning the system on its head, where we take care of the researchers, where we support the researchers. So, for instance, whenever we publish a book, an academic book from a scholar, we make sure that we are doing double and triple the royalties that they would normally get with any other publisher, and that we're doing a lot of the work to support them and promote their work. Our academic conferences are international, and they're held online. So because, the average cost for a scholar to attend an academic conference, just to speak at one, some $250 just to fly out there and just to get lodging. That doesn't even include the price of the society membership. We wanted to make sure our prices were really low and that it was easily accessible to the public rather than just having a niche group of the population, academics just talking to academics. That's why we started GCRR.
And was part of it almost getting to take advantage, a rare positive like side effect of COVID? Like people are doing conferences virtually now. People are doing the Zoom, it was the Historical Jesus Conference you had. That was the one that I checked out because I was interviewing David Fitzgerald. So it was like nice to be able to just have access to all that, and then to see the talks you wanted to see. And
Right. How did you like the conference, by the way?
I thought it was good. I mean, it's just that the topic, it's still going. I mean, I feel like, wasn't it like Moses was considered a historical figure, and then over the past like 20 years or so, it's kind of been like, so I'm wondering like, well, I don't know if the same thing will be for Jesus, but the fact that it's gotten, I don't know, it's like gotten legitimacy, and then it's also still it's one of the most poo-pooed subjects in like atheists. Like they're like, okay, attack religion, but Jesus is totally real. And then it's like, yeah, but these people, it's peer-reviewed stuff. It's not just like conspiracy theory.
Right.
Stuff. There is backing to it. There are people, Richard Carrier, and there are a bunch of other names out there that.
Yeah, and you're speaking about the Jesus mythicism, the idea that Jesus of Nazareth didn't exist. As a whole, the academic community still thinks that Jesus of Nazareth, that there was an historical personage behind that name, but the claim that he didn't exist has enough credibility behind it that it does not need to be shut out. It should actually have a voice. So, but the question of whether he existed or not has been seriously considered by academics since the 1800s, at least. You brought up Moses and other biblical characters. So many of those characters have been brought into question since at least the 1800s, when we actually developed historical criteria and ways of going about scrutinizing history, scrutinizing our sources, as opposed to, once again, just engaging in a confirmation bias to promote your own narrative and your own religious beliefs. But to answer your question, we actually had already planned to do our academic conferences virtually online, again, so that more people could attend, and so it wouldn't be a financial burden on the academics and the audience before COVID even hit. So we were already planning this stuff. It was great to kind of emerge as a bit of a leader in that area.
Well, what's the next conference you have coming up?
Yeah, it's going to be our second annual Atheism Conference. And this theme for this conference is God and Suffering. And the reason we're doing this theme, is because the famous counter-apologist John Loftus has assembled a massive team of counter-apologists to discuss the problem of horrendous suffering and how a good God, or a powerful God, or an all-knowing God, an all-loving God could exist with so much pain and suffering in the world. And so that's going to be the theme. It's actually on December 11th and 12th of this year.
And you can get your tickets, or you can get so you can, is there an option to kind of check it out live as it's going, and then to be able to check out the talks after the fact?
Yeah, there will be. So we video record every one of our conferences, and they become available. If you purchase a ticket now, you'll get a free copy of all the video presentations automatically. There's no separate charge for that. So even if you can't make the conference, you can just buy a ticket and we'll give you the recordings after the fact. But there are going to be some presentations that we will show live on Facebook or YouTube, just to offer something free, I suppose. But the tickets are only $15. So it's not a big deal at all. It's not a financial burden to attend at all.
I mean, it's less than a movie ticket, and you get to see a bunch of speakers. Like, do you have, you mentioned John Loftus. Do you have other speakers lined up already?
Yeah.
Still working on finalizing that list, I think.
Yeah, we are. There's quite a number of great speakers already. An award-winning, internationally known philosopher, David Kyle Johnson. He'll be speaking about skeptical theism and the response to gratuitous suffering. So what a lot of these speakers will be tackling individual arguments oftentimes about why God is incompatible and probably irrational to believe in a God with so much suffering. At the same time, though, the mission of GCRR isn't to debunk and isn't to deconvert. So we do have some speakers who are, in fact, going to promote some form of theism as well, that they want to discuss suffering from a psychological perspective and tie in religion with it as well. I'll be speaking. Most likely, I'll be speaking on misotheism, which is the hatred of God, specifically why a misotheist believes it is immoral to worship God because of all the pain and suffering in the world. I think people will really like some of the talks that we have coming out.
That's an angle I hadn't thought of before. Like, there's that people talk about atheists, they're like, oh, you're just mad at God. And it's like, oh, there really are people. I mean, obviously, there are people who believe in pretty much everything, but to people to believe in God and hate God, whatever God they hate, makes sense. I mean, based on, scripture and all that.
Yeah, the misotheist position is likely an atheist position, most likely. It's not somebody who actually hates God, but is somebody who says, if a God does in fact exist, then he's a moral monster. I have an obligation to hate him and in fact rebel against him because he is a moral monster. And I can actually demonstrate this to you using sound, deductive, moral logic.
All right, hit us with the logic gun, why don't you? I mean, it's all connected to all the various groups, projects you're working on. So can you tell me about Sherm?
Yeah, Sherm stands for Socio-Historical Examination of Religion and Ministry. This is the peer-reviewed academic journal that is an imprint of GCRR. It comes out twice a year, and it's got the standard, academic articles on religion, different studies, different new findings and discoveries, or some philosophical or historical musings that you would typically find in a regular academic journal. The big difference with us, of course, unlike most academic journals, is we do not charge our authors, our academics and scholars, to publish with us. And the price for an issue or an individual article is just pennies. It's only $2 to get an article usually from us, as opposed to for many academic journals, they'll charge up to $30, $50 for an article for one PDF. So again, it's going off of that philosophy that we're not in this to exploit people and to have our hands in people's pockets. We actually just love the scientific and historical study of religion, and we want other people to join us in our passion.
Yeah, that's one thing that's tough about the field of academia, is just that everything does seem kind of expensive. And then the people who do it, it's you spend years in school, and it's not like you're gonna, the only name who's like a well-known, like biblical scholar, I don't even know if that's the correct term, is like Bart Ehrman, but
right.
if you're going to go into it wanting to be Bart Ehrman, that's very unlikely. And then making things accessible to people, because all of these topics are, sometimes flying over people's heads. It's like, well, I just want to read an article. I want to become more educated, and for it to be more accessible is always a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's our big mission. It's because of the cliquish nature of academia, where there are very few Bart Ehrmans, people who can actually make a living off of their books and publications, off of their name. It's because of that the field, the academic study of religion, is in a way dying in a lot of areas, because why would you go into it? You can't make any money. It's not like being an accountant or a virologist. You're not going to really make much money. Well, we want to change that. We want people to be able to have a passion for studying religion and actually be able to do some good with it, as opposed to working 4 and 5 side jobs at the same time that you're an adjunct professor living below the poverty line.
Yeah, it's not. It's a tough gig, because you're having to do. You're not really being able to research what you want to research and put all the time into it. It's like, if you could, that'd be really, really wonderful. So when you were on the episode with Neil, you talked about a book that had come out recently at the time. That was 2019 with John Loftus on miracles. So what was your contribution there?
Yeah, my chapter is called Properly Investigating Miracle Claims. And from that, I take a look at all the different psychological variables that impact witness testimonies, and show just how much actual investigation needs to go into paranormal claims before you conclude a genuine bona fide miracle has taken place. And that there are enough psychological variables that need to be factored in that can, in fact, and we do know, distort people's perception of reality, their memories of events. So my contribution was discussing exactly how these variables come into play. So if you're going to be somebody like Craig Keener, who claims to have documented and cataloged thousands of miracle claims, yet didn't do a proper investigation to a single one of them, yet somehow thinks that that's evidence that miracles must have happened, we need to set this straight and show you exactly, no, there's actual a methodology and a process at play if you're going to investigate paranormal claims.
Is it even possible for someone to say, here's your checklist on how to investigate like an actual miracle? Because wouldn't that kind of presuppose that they exist?
I don't think
once you investigate it could be like, well, it's not a miracle. Here's the 15 crazy things that happened and made it seem like it's a miracle. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's a good point to be made not to enter into the investigation as a hyper skeptic, where you are doing nothing but seeking to disprove. At the same time, you don't need to go into the investigation. You most definitely shouldn't go into an investigation thinking that most definitely this is a miracle and I'm going to prove it so. Rather, we should have a healthy skepticism and, most of all, a desire for the truth. What really happened? And are there natural, rational explanations that should be given priority before jumping to a God of the gaps, must have been an angel, must have been a miracle, must have been a demon? Before jumping to that level, why don't we see if there are other more plausible explanations first?
Well, sometimes when it comes to believers talking to non-believers, they want to put the burden of proof on the atheist, to say, you must prove that God doesn't exist. It's like the theory of prove that Jesus didn't exist. Well, you're going to have to find every possible claim and track it all down, and then find out that you're 80% sure they're not all true. And then you like, it seems like, is it possible to like prove something isn't true? Isn't it more like you take the actual claim of here's what we think happened and investigate to actually see whether it's true or not?
In certain instances, it would be possible to demonstrate something does not exist or does exist. But it's going to be dependent on the types of sources we're using, the types of empirical evidence we can acquire. But generally, we want to fall back on a principle of parsimony, which you probably know as Occam's razor. The simplest, most probable, likely explanation is usually the correct one. So if our explanation of things ends up producing more questions than it answers, we don't have a very good explanation, and you're likely going in the wrong direction. For instance, if we were to conclude that a supernatural bona fide miracle had occurred, then we're actually left with more questions than answers. We then have to ask, so which supernatural agent, how were they able to break into our realm of existence? Are they corporeal? Are they just purely spirit? How do they exist? Where do they exist? Why did they do it in this instance, but not in others? So there are rational approaches and methodologies that we want to consider. And you are right. It is extremely difficult to prove the non-existence of something. But again, as you were suggesting, that's not our burden to have. The burden of proof always rests on the person making the claim, not the person who's skeptical about the claim.
Well, as someone who was religious and now is not, what do you think about like apologetics? Are they actually coming up with any new arguments, and are they getting any better? Do you ever have either debates or discussions with people? Obviously you must go in some of the same circles since you're, sometimes investigating the same things as the apologists.
Yeah, professionally, I haven't debated any apologists, but while I was an apologist, I debated other apologists. In fact, I debated Gary Habermas twice on the resurrection while I was one of his doctoral students. What became very immediately clear to me, especially when I started my PhD, was just how engrossed in a confirmation bias apologetics is. In fact, it's so engrossed in it, I would say it's almost very proud of it. It does not seek the truth. In fact, any definition of apologetics does not say that it's just simply trying to seek the truth. Its sole purpose is to prove that apologist's version of Christianity true, even if it's not. So it's always going to cherry pick the information. It's always going to shoehorn counter evidence or deny and ignore it entirely. One time I brought this up with Dr. Gary Habermas, and I said, it sure seems like we're just engaging in a confirmation bias. And he agreed. And he said to me, yeah, but the other side does it too. I'm not so sure about that, but there was...
It feels like some kind of logical fallacy. It's like, yeah, sure, maybe the other side does it, but does that mean you... Yeah. The debate, initially, I think that's one of the things as a baby atheist. You check all these debates, you go, man, they crushed them. And then you find out that sometimes someone can win a debate, but it doesn't mean they actually, their side is true. It's just they won the debate.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can be a good debater and, facts, sometimes.
Right. Debates especially are going to, and you know what, especially in religion, I would argue, can rely more on rhetoric than actual empirical evidence or methodology. And you know what? Sometimes we just have people aren't quick on their feet and don't recognize what for others is pretty immediately, blatantly bad rhetoric or bad arguing. I remember watching one debate between William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens. And right out of the gate, Craig opens up with a philosophical discussion, and you can see that it just takes Hitchens off guard. He just wasn't anticipating this approach. And standing there watching this, I go, oh my gosh, I can see clearly the flaws in what Craig just said, but Hitchen didn't pick it up. And that happens. That's just a human experience. Doesn't mean Craig was anywhere near close to correct. In fact, he was engaging in special pleading the entire time, but Hitchens just didn't pick it up at the time, in the moment.
Yeah, just oh, there it is. That was weird. Did you lose me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I'm not sure what's going on, but yeah. Had an issue. Oh, here we go. And we're back. Okay. Yeah, technical issues. Oh, it's lovely. Oh, for a guy I've seen in a few shows and interviews, I've never actually seen you wear a hat, but it seems like you wear lots of hats in terms of your different titles and different jobs. So I love the titles. So what is your gig as a research director for the FaithX Project?
Yeah, exactly what it sounds like. I head up a lot of their research stuff. For instance, we just completed a massive sociological study on the effects of COVID on clergy members. So how many clergy members were killed during the pandemic? And that'll be coming out in Sherm. The publication will be coming out in Sherm later this year. We also track demographic trends in religion. We track the different lifestyle trends. Now, a lot of this stuff is useful because one of the biggest purposes for FaithX is that if you're going to have a church or a synagogue or a mosque or any other kind of religious tradition and a worship center, that you ought to be doing something good for the community that you're in. And so what FaithX is dedicated to doing is helping religious leaders identify the needs of their communities by tracking the economic status of their neighbors, some of the household or crime statistics or healthcare statistics, things like that within their immediate vicinity, so that if they can actually get out of their church and do some good in the world, so that they can break out of the walls. And instead of just taking care of their little pocket of congregants, they can actually take care of humanity and the planet as well.
Well, what was the impetus, I guess, behind creating this? Because you're working with churches, and I guess in a few instances, even talking churches into saying maybe you guys should be shutting the doors.
And in many cases, sometimes the FaithX does exactly that. It's a consultation. So we do have consultants that will consult with churches that are in fact declining and dying. And the end result is you need to shut your doors. You need to close up shop. The big emphasis, now the founder and creator is Reverend Ken Howard. He's a priest in the Episcopal Church. His big passion in life is helping congregations have some kind of vitality to them. Because as any believer and non-believer who used to be a believer knows, oftentimes you go into church and it's a bit of a self-sustaining organism until it gets old enough and it just dies out. They take care of themselves and really nothing else. They don't really go out into the world to actually do anything. And so Reverend Howard's passion was to say, we got to make the church actually impactful in the world, as opposed to just having four walls and we talk to ourselves and nobody else.
Well, what are you learning about, I guess, how churches function through that? And is there going to be a problem down the road because it seems like churches are opening, but there aren't enough people to actually sit in the pews every Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, FaithX grew out of a major research project that we had done. And Ken Howard was the main author and researcher for this. And I came in as a peer reviewer to look over the data. What we found, and it's called the religion singularity, is that there are more churches and more houses of worship opening up than there are Christians converting, than there are actual growth in Christianity. So what this means is that Christianity is dividing and dividing and dividing so much at such a rapid pace that it is imploding on the inside. And in fact, it's gotten to the point, the reason they call it the religion singularity is because the increase in number of congregations and churches is so high, yet the number of Christians has stayed very low. It's gotten so high that it is going to be unsustainable. We anticipate that by the end of the century, by 2100, institutional Christianity will no longer exist. Now, that doesn't mean the religion will have disappeared. It will likely have taken on a different form. But there will be so few people inside the churches that they won't even be able to pay for the overhead. They wouldn't be able to keep the lights on because there'll be so few people. And this is because Christianity infights itself, fights and has so many internal struggles that it just divides and divides and divides and divides and divides. So it's killing itself.
Yeah, all the different versions, that's for sure. And everyone will be getting that prosperity, so they won't be going to church, right? So well, eventually, maybe it's the next level in the pyramid, or however all that works. So what do you do? Adjunct professor, Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. What's
Yeah, I teach ancient history and comparative religion for the liberal arts department. We are one of the top art schools in the world, and our students are just absolutely incredible. Our faculty is absolutely incredible. The talent and skills that our students and staff have in the art world, from sculptures to animation, illustration, computer animation, things like that, is unbelievably phenomenal. Where I come in is I help teach philosophy and religion and show just how much of an impact and influence these topics have had on them as artists. So one of my favorite topics is we talk about the origin and evolution of Yahwism, the development of God, the belief in the socio-political context that shaped century by century by century, molding how we now conceive of the divine today and how it's evolved over time.
And how is it over like COVID? Are you doing in person now, or is it?
Yep.
Okay.
Both online and in person.
Well, this isn't a question, but I just wanted to say I appreciated in your email signature that you included pronouns. That's just something that more people are doing now, and it's almost sometimes you see. It used to be like, oh, that's wow, someone put their pronouns, and now it's like, I don't know, it's starting to become more mainstream, which I like.
Yeah,
it's just inclusive in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you. Back to your question about some of the dramatic effects that we're seeing with Christianity, I think there's something else that is still in its infancy stages that I think is going to have an even bigger impact on institutional religion in general. And that is the burgeoning field of religious trauma studies. And the Global Center for Religious Research is heading up the world's very first largest sociological study on religious trauma, where we are going to be able to show with empirical data for the very first time, with empirical data, the existence of religious trauma. Now, just about every clinician, every psychiatrist and psychologist knows that trauma can and does happen within a context of religion, but it's not widely recognized. It's certainly not in the DSM. It's not a diagnosis that you would get necessarily, nor necessarily should it be. But people, we are finding in the tens of thousands, are suffering from anxiety and depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, and other diagnoses, things that are impacting their life because of religion. And it could come in so many different forms, from doctrines that you were taught as a kid, such as original sin, that you were born sinful and deserving of burning in hell, or to the more obvious examples, having been molested and raped by a priest, and the different variations in between. We're finding that religious trauma is impacting countless thousands of people. And we cannot move forward in the academic study of religious trauma without being able to actually demonstrate that it exists. And that's where we're coming in. We have set up the world's very first sociological study on it, and we're going to be able to show the world just how much, what percentage of the United States population in fact suffers from what we would diagnose or what we would label religious trauma. I'm really excited for this to come out.
I mean, is this something you suffer as well as someone who was a believer, and I'm pretty sure still has issues with probably hell and some of the beliefs that you had?
You know, I don't think I would ever classify myself as a sufferer of religious trauma. I definitely suffer from other forms of trauma, from other things. What I am very scarred with is just how poorly I saw both religious leaders and the people who claim to be devout Jesus followers, how they responded to me both when I was a minister and when I came out as an atheist. I lost everything when I came out as an atheist. I lost my entire support system, my entire family. Everything was taken from me. But one thing that always struck me, even when I was still a diehard evangelical, was there was no difference between the people in church and even the religious leaders, the people I looked up to, the ones I was wanting to mentor me, and they were my spiritual leaders. There was no difference between them and the rest of the world. I thought, man, for a religion that claims that the living God, the Holy Spirit, actually indwells inside you and actually transforms you from the inside out to make you a better person, I sure didn't see it. I didn't see it with myself. Didn't matter how much.
You would think, as someone who's studies data, it's like you would think, religious people would be happier, and you would think, totally unrelated subject, the religious people wouldn't be sad at funerals because they're in heaven, right?
Yeah.
But every time someone's there, but there's, I don't know, it's a psychological thing. What I was wondering, I mean, I definitely feel like, the trauma and what you've experienced, but how do you get this data? Like, I would guess it's really hard to do. I know there was like the census came out and, making a big deal about, you should put that you're not religious. And a lot of people will put that they're religious even though they're not. So it's hard to tell, like there might be more non-believers than we even think. And the number just keeps growing. Yes. How do you get the data that, it's great to put this out there, but how do you go, okay, I know this is, as well as I can that this is legitimate data,
absolutely.
just because of it's so hard for people to even admit these things.
Yeah, absolutely. How do we get the data? In short, very carefully.
I know it's not something you can answer in 45 seconds, but
right.
and if you can, you're good.
It is not an online poll, and we don't go about, we don't just, hey, do you suffer from religious trauma? Yes or no? That is not it. This is a fully scientific study. We have a number of people on committees. We partnered with Springtide Research Institute. We have interviewed with an in-depth, peer-reviewed survey, sociological survey, to identify some of the behavioral or what we might call some of the manifestations of trauma that people are experiencing. And this helps give us information on whether they actually do, in fact, suffer from religious trauma without being very blunt and direct to it. So this entire thing has tons of people working on it, tons of professional sociologists, psychologists, clinicians, researchers, and historians like myself. Massive committee on this thing. So no, it isn't just Fox News online poll by any means. Of course, for me to break it down and go into detail is way too much and probably outside the scope of the interview, but you can read all about it once the publication finally comes out.
That is just to tease people. This guy is I tell you, it's okay though. I just have something in the future, something coming up. You got the conference coming up, you got this coming up. It's great. You did mention, leaving religion kind of ended a community, and it's especially hard for somebody who's involved in ministry because you're supposed to believe. And then when it's all attached to who you are. How has it been for you? Kind of building community, you're doing it virtually, you're doing a lot of online stuff, but maybe in person too, in your Denver-ish Colorado area, how you do that.
Yeah. Originally when I was struggling and was a closet atheist, I was attending recovery from religion, group meetings, and that was probably my first exposure to the atheist community. And what I have found was so much grace and compassion and so much empathy. It was fairly overwhelming to know that there were other people who had been in my shoes that were there to recognize there was a genuine human experience taking place and not to trash it or to try and fix it, but to stand with you. This was stuff I rarely saw in the church. Now, I did see some wonderful human beings acting wonderfully gracious in the church. It wasn't all bad. But again, there was no difference between the church folk and the non-church folk. Non-church folk, in my experience, were just as compassionate and just as loving, if not more so. That's been a big breath of fresh air, is knowing that there are communities out there and they're willing to support you and love you.
Well, it's good to hear that that's available. You may be doing this already because it does seem like you're involved in a lot of things, but if you could drop everything, is there like a dream project that you would want to research? Something that you might put into a book or something that might take a few years, or something that maybe you're working on that is going to, come to fruition in a few years? Like what would that be?
Man, I have a running list. It's probably in the hundreds of things I would love to just spend my life doing. My passion is the socio-political development of religious belief systems. I would absolutely love to write the definitive textbook on the origins and evolution of Yahwism, and I believe that there are some pretty reasonable explanations that would help explain something like resurrection appearances. So I would love to show a lot of the stuff, even though I would just be one among thousands of people who've already done so. But I would love to show some of the research I have as an investigator and then as an historian on some of the plausible explanations for a resurrection that don't require a supernatural thing. And I'm not talking Jesus just resuscitated or something like that. I'm talking there's just reasonable explanations for why even a rumor would get started in the first place. I would love to dedicate my life to that.
Right. Well, I know so many projects, so little time. So, of course, I've mentioned, and there will be links and show notes for everything. But how can people track you down?
Yeah, the easiest way would just be to go to GCRR.org, the Global Center for Religious Research. And if you want to find me in particular, you can go to the About page, and you'll see all the people that we have working with us all over the world and our different researchers. And of course, you can attend our conferences, you can read our publications, and you're always more than welcome just to reach out to us at any time. Our main email is info@gcrr.org. So shoot us a message.
Yeah, you should do that, people. Okay, well, thank you, Darren, for being on tonight. It's been very educational.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
What have you always dreamed of?
Pleasuring myself orally.
Live read. So we wondered, after 6 episodes, would it be as good as Fast and Furious movies? Hard to say because, that's at 9, but we're on episode 7 of Woking Up. Ina talking about Sam Harris and how Sam Harris, not too far from Tucker Carlson. I think the ultimate cringe fest lately is the fact that Ricky Gervais and Sam Harris are doing a podcast and they think they're just the bee's knees. And, for the people who like that kind of stuff, you're going to really like it because it's probably terrible. If you want to support this show, you can be like Freethinker 215, Alan Marks, Human, Chris, Larry, Daryl, and the other Daryl. Go to patreon.com/Zachrilege. Follow me on Twitter, like the Zachrilege Cast on page on Facebook, and send all mail to zachrilege.cast@gmail.com. Thank you to Dr. Darren Slade for being on this week. Future guests we shall see. I've been lazy lately on that. So until then, let's continue the conversation.